Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the 2012 Royal Tyrrell Museum Speaker Series. Today, the Royal Tyrrell Museum and its cooperating society are proud to present Dr. John Noad. John is the Exploration Manager for Canada at Murphy Oil in Calgary. John obtained his undergraduate degree from Imperial College London in 1985 and then worked as a mining geologist in South Africa. He returned to the UK in 1990 and joined the phone company BT as their marine geologist responsible for analyzing submarine cable routes. During that time, he also completed a master's degree in sedimentology at night school, with his thesis focusing on the fluvial sequence stratigraphy of Dinosaur Provincial Park. He subsequently returned to London University full-time in 1995 to complete a PhD on the sedimentary evolution of eastern Borneo, where he developed a love of fossil mangroves and hot chilies. After completing his PhD, John was recruited by Shell in 1998 and worked mainly on Middle Eastern exploration before moving to Shell Canada in 2006. There, he worked as a senior exploration geologist in the Basin Center gas team in Calgary until he joined Murphy Oil in 2010 as Exploration Manager Canada. Today, John will be discussing the geologic record of ancient mangrove systems and their inhabitants using data from recent mangroves as analogs. In his talk, John will take us wading knee-deep into 20 million-year-old mangroves of eastern Borneo before taking us to the 5 million-year-old Bahama-like beaches of Mallorca. So without further delay, I present you Dr. John Noad.
Well, good morning, everybody. As Francois said, the plan today is to literally take us wading knee-deep through the mangroves of eastern Borneo and mangroves of Spain, and then we'll be using modern mangroves as a little bit of an analog to these ancient deposits. And what I've done is the talk falls naturally into two parts. The first part, we're going to talk a little bit about the sedimentology of mangroves, and the huge question is, how do you actually recognize mangroves in the fossil record? Often the trees that form the mangroves have just rotted away, so you're not really left with a lot of evidence. So we're going to be talking about some of the evidence from the rocks and the evidence from the fossils. And in the second part of the talk, I'm going to talk more about the fossils, the fauna and the flora that you'll find in modern and ancient mangroves. And then I'm just going to finish off with a little snippet on hurricanes and the hurricane impacts on mangroves and how this may explain how some mangroves have been preserved in the fossil record. So let's start off by talking a little bit about what are mangroves. And a lot of people have heard of mangroves, but not many people have actually been to visit them. Generally speaking, your nice hotel that you visit on holiday, they've cleared away all of those stinky mangroves to try and make room to put a nice hotel down, and probably imported some sand to make a nice beach. But mangroves themselves, they're typically at the margin between the sea and the land. And you need temperatures of more than 20 degrees. So sadly, we don't have any mangroves here in Canada. There's over 70 different species of mangrove trees. And the thing about them that makes them different is that they're able to survive in very variable salinities. So most plants and animals, they're really concentrated either in the sea or on land and in river conditions or lakes. But these plants are able to exist at that borderline between the land and the sea. And they make land hostile and very acidic to other species, so that it means that once they've got a foothold, they don't give up. And they can grow up to 80 feet in height, although typically you'll see them around, I suppose, around half the height of this room. And they've come more into the news in recent years, particularly because, for some reason, tsunamis seem to have caught the public's imagination. And I guess one of the reasons for that was the tsunami from the 26th of December a few years ago. But they are absolutely critical for protecting coastlines. And it's you can see here that this is the location of mangroves around the world. So there's a huge amount of land masses that are protected by mangroves. And actually clearing them is a bit of a disaster because it leaves the land open to erosion and to attack by things like tsunamis. And they provide a great haven for wildlife, invertebrates, nesting birds. A lot of fish have their nurseries within the mangroves. And then we're going to talk later on about some of the vertebrate species that you may see there. So mangroves occur, there's all sorts of types of mangroves, both in terms of size, species, height, everything. But what I've done is I've just put this diagram in here just to show that at the coastline you typically get what are called the dwarf mangroves. So you'll have very small plants. They may only be knee-high. And then as you go inland, the mangrove plants get bigger, and you change from these mangroves with the rooted systems, with these prop roots, to ones which are more buttress-like here as you go further inland. And I guess one of the ones that you may have heard of, Niper here, is the date palm. And that's actually a mangrove resident. So that's probably the most familiar. So the mangroves that occur most commonly, you see most often, are the red and the black mangroves. And these are imaginatively named based on the color of the bark. There are also white mangroves, and there's no prizes for guessing what they're named after. But we're going to talk about the red and the black mangroves for now. So the red mangrove is called Rhizophora, and very common in Southeast Asia. And these are the ones that you'll often see in films with these really striking prop root developments. They're generally found closer to the water's edge, and they exude the salt from the roots in water. And this is really the problem for mangroves, because if you have a mangrove plant, within the sap, the concentration of salt is about 1/70th what you see in seawater. So they have to have a way of getting rid of all this salt. So they use all sorts of different systems to do that. And the only other thing that's really special about these red mangroves is they breed by what are called propagules. And this is a propagule here. And if you go to somewhere like the Bahamas or Southeast Asia, you'll find these on beaches. But the real idea of the plant is that they'll drop this propagule like an arrow that should just drop down onto the mud, preferably while the tide's out, and it should embed itself, and then that allows the plant to start growing. And it will grow its roots within the tidal cycle to hold fast to try and start developing a new mangrove plant. So if you see them floating around, normally those ones aren't going to germinate. The other mangrove we're going to look at in a little more detail is the black mangrove. This is Avicennia, it's called. And these have long, heavy roots in the subsurface, but then they have these very striking little things called pneumatophores. And these roots are poking up from a subsurface root system that's under here, and then it pokes all of these little roots up in order to try and source oxygen. They grow in soils which are often exposed at low tides, and unlike the red mangroves, they exude the salt from their leaves. And the seeds, they're the size of lima beans, and they're a little bit different because these seeds can be moved around by the sea, and then they can just germinate wherever they end up. So what I'm going to do now is to talk about the sedimentology of mangroves. So this is like the evidence from the rock record. And there's two types of mangroves, and there is a little bit of a blurred line between them. And this isn't something you'll find in the literature, and that's really because I haven't got around to publishing the paper yet, which is a little bit unfortunate. And I had great ideas that I was going to publish all of this up, but for now this is just between us, really. So we're going to talk about arid versus humid mangroves, and basically these relate to carbonate versus clastic mangroves, so sandy versus limey mangroves. And any of these terms can apply, and I'll explain a little bit more as we go through. So let's start off with some humid mangroves, and we're going to go to Borneo, in fact to an area of eastern Borneo around the town of Sandakan. So let's look at the location of the study areas for humid mangroves. So by humid mangroves, I'm talking about humid, tropical conditions, high rainfall, muds and sands are generally the types of deposits. And the ancient ones we're going to look at are just here. This is what they call the Dog's Head of Borneo, sitting up in here. There's Indonesia over here. Australia's down further to the southeast. And then the modern mangroves that I've looked at from this are from Miami and from Key West and Shark Key, this area here in the southern Florida Keys. So you can see one of the reasons why it's good to study mangroves is they're all in lovely warm conditions. So, the Sandakan Peninsula, it's around 20 kilometers across by 20 north-south, and I spent happy 3 or 4 months there collecting data for my PhD and basically logging around 140 sections. And of these sections, about 15 of them featured fossil mangrove deposits. And it's worth bearing in mind that at the time, when I first found them, I wasn't sure whether they were mangroves or not. And this is what really prompted me to try and collect more data on ancient mangroves to try and prove the theory that these were actually mangrove deposits. So this is where they crop out on our peninsula. And I've just put this, this is my paleo interpretation. So this is what was happening 20 million years ago. We had a land mass sitting down to the south, which, as you can see, is now under the sea. So I haven't got a lot of proof for that beyond these mangrove deposits. And then as you go further to the north, you pass through a shallow marine regime, which is in yellow, and then out into a more open marine set of conditions. But the mangroves here are occurring close to this paleo landmass. So this is actually it's nice for me because I remember all these localities by their numbers, because that's how I visited them. Obviously, locality 1 was the first location I went to, and this is what I called Bird Quarry, and we'll see why it was called Bird Quarry in a few minutes, but it's also locality 12. So the 12th place I went to in my PhD, and then I found all these amazing fossils there and amazing sediments that I'd never seen before. So it was really pretty lucky because it kept my interest up for the rest of the study. So what you can see in this section here, this section is actually about 130 meters from bottom here to top here in the quarry. And we had a succession of mudstones with a few fossils in them. Then we had some sandy beds sitting in here. We had some tidal flat deposits, which were clearly tidal because of the type of rippling in them, and the ripples were mixes of sand and mud, suggesting that you had variations in tidal regime. A little bit more mudstone, and then you had these striking thick sandstone bodies, very similar to that first picture I showed you on the previous slide. And you can see these sand bodies here probably stretched for about 60 meters in thickness altogether. And they had classic wave-rippled horizons, which have been nicely cemented up, and then thick trough cross-bedding. So, and cross-bedding indicating that we had some kind of offshore dune deposits. But we had these enigmatic green-colored rocks in here, and as you can see, I've labeled them as mangroves, but at the time that I found them, I could see that there were rooted trees in them, and there were also these very unusual fossil lobsters. And it's amazing, you can walk around in this area here and just pick up, if you're lucky, 4 or 5 fossil lobsters in 20 or 30 minutes. So there's a lot of these fossil lobsters there. So at the time, I thought, okay, there's some trees in here, and some of them seem to be rooted, which might suggest that either it's a terrestrial setting or it might be something like a mangrove, and these lobsters. But it wasn't until later on when I had the lobsters identified that they started to home in on what the environment was. So this is what, then I started looking at the sandstone bodies within the muds. So you can see here, we've got some channel-like sand bodies here, and then we've got some sheet-like sand bodies here. And I'll just put some color on there so that you can pick out where these channelized bodies were. And I've interpreted these as channels and then as broads, which are wide open areas of water. And the channels had very few sedimentary features. If you go and look at river deposits, so if you guys go out to Dinosaur Provincial Park, for example, you'll see that the river deposits there are full of crossbeds. And these crossbeds are suggesting that you've had currents moving sediment. And you'll either see trough crossbeds, or you'll see these lateral accretion surfaces, which are all sorts of really significant sedimentary structures. But in here, you really don't see many of these structures. And also in these more channelized sand bodies, you don't see any of these structures. So why aren't these structures here? And I wondered about this, so I went to look at some modern analogues in mangrove systems to try and see why that might be. So this is a modern mangrove series of channels which occurred just offshore from Miami, and we'll come back and talk about this little set of outcrops a little bit later on. But basically, the whole section that I looked at is about 150 meters long. So you don't have to have 140 square kilometers of Dinosaur Provincial Park to go and look at geology. You can look at a very small area and start picking up a lot of useful information. And what I saw in the modern mangrove channels, you'd have these very narrow channels here. This one is 70 centimeters wide, but this channel was maybe a meter and a half in depth. And the reason for that is that you have so many mangrove roots that are just constraining the channel. So this is very unusual that you see channels that are deeper than they are wide. And anyone who's ever tried to wade across the Red Deer River is probably only a couple of meters, 3 or 4 meters deep, and yet width-wise it's maybe 100, 120 meters wide. So this is very unusual, and this is actually quite a nice feature of mangroves, and that helped me to come to the realization that I was looking at mangroves in the fossil record as well. So just to talk a little bit about the Broads, so when I went down to Florida, I looked at a lot of different mangrove systems, and I actually kayaked around and visited a lot of mangroves. And I can tell you that it all looks very nice and flat here, but when the wind gets up, you're in a wobbly kayak and you're trying to take photos of these mangroves. And I capsized a couple of times during the trip. So waterproof cameras are recommended. Anyway, while I was canoeing around, then I found these open areas within the mangroves, which I've called Broads. And I don't know how many of you have heard of the Norfolk Broads in the UK. The Norfolk Broads is an area of the big lake system in the UK, very flat topography, and then running through it you have all these lake systems, and it's very popular for taking canal boats and things down. So I called them Broads, and I only found out afterwards that these Broads are completely, the ones in the UK and the Norfolk Broads are completely unnatural, and they're actually old peat workings that are later flooded. So I've named my natural type of depositional environment after something that's artificial. But anyway, we'll stick with the name Broads for now. So here we have Broads and channels. And just to put these together in a reconstruction, this is how I imagine it would look in our Sandakan Formation 20 million years ago. You've got the channels running through and coming into these big open areas here. And then depositionally, you'll have some big sheet-like deposits here, which will be where your Broads were. And then you have these deep, relatively deep and narrow channels that are running through them. And then I should just talk about some of the other depositional systems that you see in mangroves. It's all very well to say, yes, it's all channels and Broads, but I found when I went on holiday a couple of weeks ago that is not always the case. And what you also get is these opportunist mangroves, which would just colonize environments which they didn't start off. So, for instance, at the edge of estuaries, as in this area here, you've got mangroves building up, and there's just no channels in there at all, and there's no Broads. They're just fringing the estuary. And then this is on the beach in Mozambique, close to Maputo. And here you've just got a few mangroves just beginning to colonize along the coast. And they've got a foothold there, but they don't seem to have really extended for a great deal of distance. And I think what you're going to need to extend these mangroves is to start changing your relative sea level. And that hasn't happened. So these are what I call the opportunist colonizers. So they haven't quite developed a full depositional system yet, but they're getting there. So let's talk about the arid mangroves now. So this is carbonate mangroves, so limestones rather than sandstones. And I've got to mention Hilda here. And I was a half-time lecturer at Delft University for 2 years, running the master's course in petroleum geology there. And Hilda was my master's student, and I supervised her master's project working on these rocks. So she's responsible for a lot of the data that I'm going to show today. So the location of the Santanyi Formation, we're looking at Majorca, which is, there's Spain sitting there, there's Portugal. See another really nice, warm, friendly location to go and do field work. And then this is Majorca sitting here. It's one of the islands, the Balearic Islands they're called, which are located offshore from Spain. And the outcrops we looked at were all along the coast here. So because they're all along the coast and the coast is relatively linear, it's a relatively 2D setting. We haven't got three-dimensional control. We've only got really two-dimensional control because we've just got a line of outcrops. So we had to infer some of the three-dimensional geometries. And you can see they're around 10 million years old, so a little bit younger than the rocks we were looking at in Sandakan. And the paleoclimate was very arid. So we're in more of a kind of like Qatar or something like that, Abu Dhabi, that kind of setting, with fringing mangroves on the coast, but very little mangroves extending further inland from there. So this is what the mangroves look like. This is a classic section through some of the rocks. The sections all the way along the coast are very similar, actually, in the rocks we looked at. So you have limestones, which are heavily rooted with mangroves, and then interbedded with nice algal deposits, and then some really nice tidal deposits as well. And this is exactly what you would expect to see in a mangrove system. You've got that they're typically located in a tidal regime. But this raises quite an interesting question. When is a mangrove a mangrove? And basically, this was a lime mudstone, and then the lime mudstone was colonized by plants that rooted it. So actually, the rooting happened after the limestone got there. So in some ways, this is an alteration of the original rock. So you can make any rock into a mangrove deposit if you just put it in the right setting for mangrove plants to colonize it. So in some ways, mangrove deposits, certainly in this regime where the roots are preserved, and that they're not preserved in the humid systems, they rot away, but where the roots are preserved, then it's almost like a diagenetic deposit. It's a secondary deposit rather than being a primary rock fabric. And this is what the rooting looks like. So let's look at some of the associated rocks. Stromatolitic deposits here, so these are algal mats that are building up in our saline lagoons. beautiful herringbone cross-stratification here. And this is where you have cross-stratification going in one direction and going in a different direction underneath. And this is supposed to represent tidal conditions. And then we also have some fenestra here, some carbonate shell banks. There's fossil shells in here. And then rippled sediments with stromatolites within them as well. So these are all nice tidal deposits. And associated with them, we have these really striking rooted mangroves. So each of these pictures represents rooted horizons within our overall carbonate system. Here's another one sitting in here. There's a little pencil there for scale. Typically about 1 meter in thickness, but something's happened to allow the mangroves to colonize there. And this particular one is nice that it's had exposure, and you get these green shales. There's a green shale sitting up here, and the shale has actually worked its way down within the mangrove deposit. So these are good evidence that we've got terrestrial and tidal conditions. And the rooting really can only be from mangrove plants. And what Hilda did for her project, I'm not going to talk about it today, was that she used this to model this as a petroleum system. And so she had amazing vertical permeability, which you don't normally see in rocks. Normally, the horizontal permeability is higher. And so she modeled these as an unusual system. Then we also see sheet-like deposits in these. So we have sheet-like mangrove deposits extending along the coast, and also some mouthbar deposits, which may or may not be rooted. So nice variety of depositional fabrics. And when you put them all together, this is a modern example from Qatar. And you can't quite see it here. I love this photo. This photo was given to me by somebody from Shell when I worked at Shell, who said, you have to look at this mangrove photo. And if you look very carefully in the middle here, there's actually a boat there. And the boat was washed in by a tropical storm from out at sea, washed across the mangroves and just dropped there. And it's complete. You can't rescue it. It's just lost forever, and it's just sitting in the middle of the mangrove. So it's nice to use a boat for scale. Anyway, the Santanyi Formation, the reconstruction is mouth bars, then lots of rooted deposits here, rooted depositional systems. You've got tidal flats, and then occasional exposure surfaces here with pebbles. So that's your mental picture of looking at a more arid mangrove system. And you can see here that you have a few channels with mangroves fringing them, but beyond that, they don't extend inshore at all. And that's a real classic feature of these arid mangroves. And this is from Qatar. I didn't take this picture myself. I haven't been to Qatar, but a lady from Fugro gave this to me. And you can see that it's a much drier, more arid system, and the mangroves really don't extend far beyond the channel boundaries. So humid versus arid. We've got our broads and channels in this system, and then we've got our much more carbonate system. No channels in here, you notice. No broads as such. Really different systems. Both mangroves, both forming in roughly the same latitudes, but the difference is this has lots of rainfall, and this has less, and this one is sands and muds, and this one is carbonates. So it's all about, really all about climate, well, all about the amount of precipitation you get and how that moves the sediment around. So just to summarize, clastic mangroves, sandy channels, much of the vegetation has rotted away, unusual mineralization of trees, which we'll come to in a second, and no stromatolites or algal deposits or anything like that. And then the carbonate deposits, preserved root systems, lots of stromatolites, halite crystals you see in these systems. The mangrove flora is usually a lot more dwarven because it's a challenging environment. So that's once again this picture from Qatar to show you how limited they are, limited lateral extent. And as I said before, any of these lithofacies could be rooted. So any facies theoretically can be a mangrove. So let's move on to the second part of the talk and talk about some of the animals and plants that you see in the system. And we'll start off with Sandakan's fossil mangrove forest. So I went to visit this nice muddy outcrop in Sandakan, and it was just big, flat, muddy area like this. And normally these areas are built on by any locals, any flat area of ground, there'll be houses on it. But the nice thing about this outcrop, it was right next to the chief of police's house. So no squatters were able to go and live on this area. So basically he was the guardian of the fossil mangrove forest of Sandakan. So I owe him a lot. And then when I went there, I found that there were lots of these rooted trees. And it was nice because each season I'd go back and they would have eroded out a little bit more. And you can see they have charcoal rims. So these are like charcoal buttresses. And then they have these permineralized centers. So really quite an unusual form of preservation. And then this is a cross-section through one of these trees. And this one is charcoalized. And I don't know if you can see at the back, but trust me, this is all ringed. So there's definitely some seasonality to the climate. And then this is just a nice fossil log here with a field notebook for scale to give you an idea how big they are. So the preservation is great, lots of rooted trees, but is it a mangrove? And I had some seashells in this deposit, but I needed more evidence to prove whether or not it was a mangrove, and we'll talk about that evidence. So just to compare that example with the buttresses, I went to a place called Kuala Selangor near Kuala Lumpur, and on the mainland of, and it's actually a nice park. It's a firefly national park, because there's a lot of fireflies there, obviously, but because of that, they're preserving the mangroves there as well. And some of them look like this. So I had my analogue sitting there with nice buttress trees, and it had lots of fauna and flora there as well. So I had some things to try and compare to my ancient deposits. I also found fossil leaves, and these leaves are from Sandakan, from some of the sandy deposits, and I was all excited because I thought, brilliant, I can take the leaves back and have them analysed and identified, and they'll hopefully be mangroves. But unfortunately, it's not that easy. And I talked to 2 leaf specialists, one in the UK and one in Borneo, and they just said, you really can't do anything with leaves. Shapes can give you a little bit of an idea, but beyond that, you can't identify leaves in the fossil record. And so these are the shapes of modern mangrove leaves, and you can see they bear a close resemblance to my leaves. So that's a little bit of positive evidence. And then this one here, this is a cast of a leaf on an exposure surface. So I've got some evidence, but it's hardly clinching. What about roots? Well, this is a modern mangrove that we spent a happy half an hour cutting a little trench through it, and you really can't see anything in this. It's got some stratification, slightly, but the roots are rotted, and there's so many roots in there and so many small animals burrowing through it. They churn up the sediment and you can't see very much. There's a little bit of mangrove plant material here on a bedding plane, and there are a couple of roots in here, but really you can't say much about roots. And I was hoping to see some of the things I showed you at the beginning. Fossil prop roots, fossil pneumatophores, fossil embryonic seeds, you know, those propagules would have been wonderful, but I never actually found any of those. So I needed to look at some of the other evidence. So luckily, there were some other great fossils there. And one of the fossils was that there were these big chunks of amber. And I've used this coin, which you see I've carefully taken a photo of so you can't see what the value is. But actually, this amber clast is about 10 to 12 centimeters across. And there were quite a few of them. And I gave them to the Natural History Museum, and they actually held an open day for the public to come in and split these amber samples. So they split them, and I was out in Borneo, and I had this phone call at my hotel at about 4 in the morning because the guy from the Natural History Museum in England hadn't really done his calculations right to tell me that they'd found insects in my amber. I was happy about the call. So they found ants in there. This is a fossil ant from Sandakan, and this is just to compare to some modern ants actually on Rhizophora, the red mangroves we looked at earlier, from Queensland. So yes, there's ants, but there are ants in lots of environments. And they also found this beautiful parasitic wasp, which is a new species, and a nice little millipede there as well. And I actually was looking on the internet the other night on eBay, and they had a slightly better preserved millipede than mine in amber for sale for $2,800. And I gave mine to the Natural History Museum. Damn. So lots of different fossil insects, but once again, they're not smoking guns for mangroves. So what else was there? Well, the absolute key to this mangrove deposits turned out to be those lobsters. And these are some of the pictures of the mangrove lobsters. So this is the back of the lobster here, and this is its legs coming down at the side. You can see it's about 10 centimeters long. And then it has these big boxer-like claws at the front. And there's one of the claws there and another claw here. And actually the smaller claws as well have a very distinctive structure. And this is what a modern one looks like. And the reason why it has this strange grain to this photograph is it's a picture of a postcard, because they're very, very shy, the mangrove lobster. Even if we were even creeping around in the mangroves, they are so smart and so sensitive that you just never see them. So you see their nice mounds like this, but you never ever see the mangrove lobsters themselves. And I have a suspicion the guy who took this photograph got a dead one and put it on the burrow, because I've literally never seen a live one. But anyway, that's what they look like, and these claw segments here are enough to identify them. So this was pretty much definitive evidence that we were looking at fossil mangrove deposits, which was really very exciting. And then their tracks are also pretty distinctive, and this is modern mangrove lobster tracks with a little fish there for scale, a little lungfish for scale, mudskipper. And then these are ancient ones, so this is once again back in Sandakan, 20 million years old. And these are some of the tracks. And I've just zoomed in to show you that they do have this kind of teardrop-shaped distinctive pattern. And this is very nice because if you can find these in core, if you have a piece of core and you break it open and there's lobster tracks on it, then you've got enough to say that you're likely in a mangrove setting. So what else was there? Well, one of the things that's supposed to be a really good representation is that if you have oysters that grow on prop roots, oysters grow around them and they end up with an impression of the prop root on the inside of the oyster shell because the shell grows around them. So I collected lots and lots and lots of fossil oyster bits and pieces from the fossil mangroves, and none of them had these nice shapes on them that would identify them. But there were some other things which were nice for marine evidence. So we had, in the fossil wood, they were bored by these teredos, the shipworms, which you still see on boats and pieces of wood today. So that was nice evidence that my wood had been in a marine setting, which helped us to support the mangrove model. And there are also these very odd worm tubes here, which we still never really identified. The Natural History Museum had never seen anything like them because they're worm tubes, but most of them are solid. They don't have a hollow center, so it's impossible to understand where the animal might have lived. So they're a little bit enigmatic. The jury's still out. There are also a lot of mollusks, and I collected hundreds of gastropods and took them back to the Natural History Museum. In fact, I suspect the Natural History Museum might have got a little bit sick of me after a while with all the stuff that I was taking to them. But I talked to the gastropod specialists there, and a lot of them were cerithiids and vicariids, and these are both classic mangrove indicators as well. And in fact, when I went to St. Lucia in South Africa a couple of weeks ago on my spring holiday, they had posters up about the cerithiid gastropods as well. So that was very nice. And they made these nice trackways. And this is what they look like. They're just lying around there and then wandering around on the mangroves and leaving these tracks. But there's lots of them, and they're very good indicators of mangroves as well. Now, there's lots of other vertebrate inhabitants of the mangroves, and some of them are very exciting. And I'm a big bird watcher, but we'll come to some of the other more mammalian ones, but certainly in terms of birds, these pictures are all taken in the mangroves. So this is in Florida, some of the pelicans, slightly different species to the ones we see up here, but really quite similar. Egrets, and then this lovely osprey here with a fish in its claws, which is really nice, although that break across there, I think the fish got killed by a propeller. I don't think the osprey caught it, but still, nice picture. And their footprints as well. So why am I showing this particularly is because one of the most exciting things that I found, and the reason why I named my Sandakan outcrop bird quarry, was because I found bird footprints there. And these were the first fossil bird footprints reported from Borneo. So I've circled a couple of these footprints on here on this hand specimen, and then this is just the lump of rock that I found them on. So this is at the base of a channel. So there was a mudstone under the channel, and then the sand must have washed in gently at the bottom of the channel and then been cemented. So it literally cemented these tracks. And in consultation with a bird expert, they suggested it was likely to be a plover-like bird, something like this, that made the tracks. So that was really exciting as well. And it's kind of nice when you find bird tracks, because if nothing else, it suggests that you can't be in too marine an environment. You know, if the water depth is more than a few centimeters, those birds are not going to have legs 10 meters long to make the bird footprints on the seabed. So that's also an indication you're not in fully marine conditions. Mangrove fish. Well, I didn't find a lot of evidence of fish. I had these very dubious ray feeding traces that one guy said to me, definitely that's a ray feeding trace, and everyone else, including Adolf Seilacker and a couple of other very famous trace fossil guys, just laughed at me when I suggested that they might be fish remains. So the jury was out on these, and so I didn't find a lot of fish remains there. A couple of vertebrae in thin section, and that was it. And it's pretty unusual because the Miocene was an acme for fish. All of those fossil shark teeth that you see people wearing on pendants, they're all Miocene. So I was a little bit surprised not to find them in my deposits. So that, you know, maybe they're there, and maybe I didn't find them, but I don't think so. And I've just put these modern pictures in to show that there are. This is a pufferfish from Miami, and this was very exciting. I walked out onto this near Key West, and I was walking around on this little carbonate platform here, looking at mangroves, and I suddenly noticed there's these sharks literally swimming around my legs. And I think they're dog sharks. I don't think they were going to bite me, but you know, you suddenly see a 3-foot shark right next to you, like, whoa. So mangrove deer, modern and ancient. There's a very famous, well, very famous to people who study deer from fossil mangroves anyway. There's a deer called the Key deer, which only lives on 3 of the keys, and it basically feeds on mangroves. And this picture here, I have to be honest with you, is not exactly mangrove, but I put it in to give you an idea of how the deer live when they're in the mangrove environment. But this key deer does live in the mangroves, and I found fossil deer footprints, and this is a really great surface, which we'll talk about in a minute, but these holes here, these are deer footprints, and my modern analog is sitting here, which is impalas walking on sand. But the tracks are almost identical in shape, and there's a lot of them, and I wasn't able to kind of track them right across the surface to choose deer by deer, but I'm pretty sure that those are deer footprints. Mangrove turtles, ancient and modern. These are modern ones from the Florida Everglades. And then this guy here, this is a really nice humerus that I found. And I wasn't quite sure what animal it was from when I found it, so I sent it off to a mammal expert in France who wrote back and said, actually, it's from a turtle. So you learn something every day. But quite similar to the things like trionyx that you guys find in Dinosaur Provincial Park. And then other vertebrates. Well, I didn't find other vertebrates, but I wanted to put this slide in just to give you guys a bit of a frisson of excitement. So we've got hippos who are living in the mangroves, and I saw these hippos, 2 weeks ago in St. Lucia on the coast of South Africa. This is mangrove plants in the background, and this is where they enter and leave the water. And I've got this great publication from the South African Naturalist Association about hippos and mangroves, and apparently hippos are responsible for 67% of channel avulsions in the mangroves. So 67% of channels switching their course is because the hippos are basically just wandering through the mangroves, cutting new channels and opening up new channels for the actual river channels to follow. I've also put in this picture of crocodiles. Now, I actually found a trail that led down to these mangroves. So I went down with my wife and our daughter, who is 9 months old. So my wife had her on the chest, and we wandered down to the mangroves. And there were all these signs like this around, but we just ignored them. And we got down very close to the shore, and my wife said, she's kind of hanging back a bit. She wasn't quite as keen on going into the mangroves as I was. And she said, just look out for the, and as she said the, I almost trod on a crocodile. It was about 2 feet in front of me and about 5 feet long, and the crocodile and I both leapt vertically into the air, and then the crocodile just shot off. So I don't have a picture of it because it was far too quick, even though I was holding the camera. And I was a little bit shaky afterwards, but my wife was like, I told you so, I told you. But it was well worth it anyway, just to see those crocodiles in life position. And then I put this picture in because I remembered this from the Telegraph a couple of years ago, where they released a tiger from captivity into the Indian mangroves. And so there are tigers living out in India and in some of the mangroves there. And there's obviously not many of them left, but this is just such an epic photo of this tiger leaping from a boat. That's not my picture, somebody else's. And then where were they in Sandakan? Well, we've already talked about the fish missing. And there's a lot of horseshoe crabs in mangroves, and they stretch way back into time, but I've never seen any of those. And I've actually never seen any fossil crabs in the mangroves. And if you go to any modern mangrove, there's crabs everywhere. So where are they? And the only thing I can think of is that their shells may have dissolved, their carapaces may have dissolved. But I would like to keep on looking because I found lots of fossil crabs in other environments, just not in the mangroves when I was working in Borneo. And then I mentioned that supersurface earlier, the surface with the deer footprints, and I'm just showing this just to show some of the exciting rocks that you get. So this is an abandonment surface at the top of one of those mangrove channels from my Sandakan Formation, 20 million years old. And you can see that every arrow here is a footprint. And on this surface were lobster footprints, which are shown with the brown arrows, leaves, fossil leaves, like this leaf shape sitting in here, rill marks, which are made by the fronds of vegetation waving backwards and forwards, and the footprints here, which are those deer footprints as well. So it's like a snapshot in time, which has a little bit of everything on it, which is just, it's lovely to see. And then just to reconstruct, this is what I imagined Sandakan looked like at the time, with a few fossil birds here pulling worms out of the sediment. There probably were crabs there. Lots of these mangrove trees, which we've seen the pictures of the trees, and then some nice gastropods hanging around as well, leaving trails in the sediment. So, and then, of course, we mustn't forget to mention Thalassina, the mangrove lobster, hard at work building its burrow. And then I'm just going to finish off by talking a little bit about after the hurricane. And the reason I put this in is just to show what can happen to mangroves when the weather turns nasty. So this is hurricane, I think it's Hurricane Katrina. But it certainly happened in 2004, and so my field area that I went and looked at was kind of down here, so quite close to the eye of the hurricane. And it's a really beautiful, dramatic image, this one. So I went to look to see what had happened to the mangroves after this hurricane had hit. So this is my field area, which is called Key Biscayne, which is about 4 kilometers off the coast of Miami, and you can just drive there. There's a road with a bridge that goes out there. So my field area is right by the main road onto the quay, so that was very handy. And like I said, it's about 150, 200 meters long, and I just looked at 50 meters north-south, something like that. So this is what it looks like when I've just drawn a little sketch to kind of demonstrate. You've got a couple of little delta deposits. You've got the channels that we looked at earlier to get some evidence on channel morphology. And then I've drawn these logs here as well. So when you go and look at these deposits themselves, what you see is that a lot of the trees are perfectly aligned, and they are aligned in the direction that the huge hurricane came ashore. So the hurricane, they actually tracked the route, so it started off over here on the wall, worked its way across the beach, and basically knocked all these trees down in this orientation, or you can see from another angle here in this orientation. And killed all the pneumatophores. Everything was swamped by sand. A lot of the mangrove trees died as well, and not just the ones that were knocked over, but you can see all the ones at the edge here died as well. So what might happen after that? I thought about what the potential consequences would be. One would be that everything silts up, more sand ingress, and all of the mangroves die off. The second one would be that the mangrove channels would bypass the sandbar, the system would reach equilibrium, and you'd start getting little washover fans in here, and the mangroves would stay alive behind. And then the third one was that the mangroves would come and colonize this area after the mangroves had died off, and they'd colonize and regrow. So those are the scenarios I came up with, and this is what had actually happened. And it looks like a happy ending, because where that sand had been dumped by the hurricane and where the trees had all been killed off, you've got all these new little pneumatophores, these roots growing up to get the oxygen. So and new seedlings as well. There's some new little seedlings growing in here as well. So it looks like the mangroves are pretty robust. But it could explain some of the things like some of the shelly horizons that I saw in my Sandakan formation as well. So just a few conclusions. First of all, we've talked about the diagnostic criteria for identifying fossil mangroves, and I put them in here. I think the most important ones in terms of fossil related are the mangrove lobsters and their tracks. And then the most important sedimentary ones is to see these very unusual channels, which are deeper than they are broad, and then their association with relatively massive sheet-like beds. And if they've got coals in them, that's also a good indication that you may have a mangrove deposit. And then, is the present the key to the past? Well, as far as fossils go, very similar families in the modern and the ancient record. The flora are often similar, and I didn't talk about pollen because this is not supposed to be a microscopic study, but the pollen is very, very similar. And if you're lucky enough to have pollen preserved, then that helps to identify your mangroves. And it suggests that mangroves have been fairly similar through time. And I should go back to Sandakan to try and find some more crabs in there as well. And this here, mangrove character is not always the same. Things like mangrove islands, you get these little islands of mangroves where they'll just build up, and you actually see these in the Everglades as well. You have grassland with little areas of mangroves within it. And I haven't yet seen those in the fossil record, so that's something else to look for. And then as far as sedimentary goes, the Everglades have very similar channels and broads to what we've seen in our fossil Sandakan deposit, and haven't seen any mouth bars really in the modern environment, but I haven't really been to enough modern carbonate mangroves, so that obviously the next thing to do is for me to go on holiday to somewhere like the Bahamas, particularly if I can get some funding from the Tyrrell. And then finally, the channel data from Key Biscayne supports the idea that was the channel data from that last little outcrop that we looked at, supports the idea that the channels really don't migrate in these systems because they're constrained by roots. So I'm going to finish there. Thank you for your attention, and I welcome any questions. Thanks.